Russian dictator Vladimir Putin appeared in military uniform on the final day of the Russian-Belarusian exercises Zapad 2025. This is the second time the Kremlin leader has appeared in public not in a suit but in camouflage.
This is a mistaken claim by the so-called Institute for the Study of War. The point is that the Russian dictator is trying to preserve good clay despite a bad elite. September 15th, the Ministry of Defense of Belarus reported that American military personnel arrived at the field in Belarus where the joint Russian-Belarusian exercises were taking place. Moreover, they were personally greeted by the Minister of Defense of the Republic of Belarus, Viktor Krenin. And it should be noted that this visit by American military personnel and their meeting with the Minister of Defense of the Republic of Belarus is in fact a signal to the Russian Federation from both the United States and the Republic of Belarus about a warming of relations between the US and the Republic of Belarus. On September 16th, Putin appears in the Nizhny Novgorod region at the Molino training ground, where the final stage of these exercises is taking place. That is what this is about. This is in fact the Russian Federation's response to the actions of the United States.
Meanwhile, while Putin was supposedly saving his allies, since, as he himself stated, the purpose of the exercises was to protect the Union state from any aggression, partisans from the ATESH movement paralyzed a railway junction near Yekaterinburg. It is reported that there has been a disruption of train movements along all strategic routes. In particular, this junction was used to deliver ammunition, armored vehicles, fuel and personnel to the front, as well as to service factories and warehouses in the north and east. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is threatening foreign military personnel who may be present in Ukraine as part of peacekeeping missions.
By forming so-called peacekeeping forces, which are in fact occupation forces, and by discussing the creation of an airless zone, a no-fly zone over Ukraine, they are now debating whether it is permissible to shoot down aircraft.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that our country has stopped 3 Russian offensive campaigns, but the occupying country is planning 2 more. Zelensky said that the Russians have suffered heavy casualties and lost a large amount of equipment, which is why they are currently under a lot of stress. According to the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, in the first 8.5 months of 2025, Ukrainian defenders eliminated more than 305,000 Russian army servicemen. This figure demonstrates the effectiveness of defensive actions and the high professionalism of the Ukrainian troops, Syrsky emphasized.
When talking about the failed nature of the summer campaign of the Russian occupation army, it refers specifically to the failure to achieve the political level objectives set before the Russian military command, namely, the establishment of designated buffer zones in the territories of Sumy, Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk regions.
A Russian fishing vessel ended up in the strait near Sweden, allegedly due to engine problems. As a result, the Swedish Coast Guard and 2 NATO ships from Denmark and the United Kingdom launched a security operation.
This vessel may be used by the Russian Federation for conducting reconnaissance activities, that is, either launching unmanned aerial vehicles or accordingly damaging cables on the bottom of the Baltic Sea, which has been repeatedly demonstrated by the occupiers before. It should also be noted that simultaneously with these reports from the Danish side on the day of the airspace violation by Russian drones over Poland, German special forces boarded another cargo ship with a crew from the Russian Federation in the Kiev Canal, which, according to German intelligence services, was used to launch UAVs on German territory.
The IAA team recorded shelling near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. After the shells hit, observers recorded black smoke in 3 locations near the plant.
The Russian Federation uses provocations of this kind at high-risk energy infrastructure sites, specifically nuclear power plants, to create an image of Ukraine as a dangerous country. This serves to portray Ukraine as a terrorist state and accordingly to justify the possibility of implementing a national doctrine for the preemptive use of nuclear weapons.
Ukrainian soldiers have started placing wire inside the pipe through which the occupiers are trying to get into Kupiansk. 3 pipes that the occupiers could use to infiltrate Ukrainian-controlled territory have been blown up. The fourth pipe, as we can see, is completely under Ukrainian control.
Now, friends, let's discuss the military results of the Zapad 2025 exercises. After all, the Russians are now leaving the territory of Belarus, but a lot of interesting details have emerged, including how American troops appeared on Belarusian territory, as well as Indian troops, what influence China had on these exercises, and what agreements it reached with Poland. We'll discuss all of this now, but I want you to help the unit called Shostny Dobusha. This is a battalion of unmanned systems, the 68th Separate Jaeger Brigade. For a year and a half, they have been destroying the enemy in the Pokrovsky direction, the hottest spot on the front right now. We are raising 1 million hryvnias for 3 pickup trucks so that Ukraine's defenders can go out on combat missions and accordingly return from them alive and unharmed. Please join this fundraiser. And now I'd like to introduce our guest, Pavlo Kichuk, military expert and head of security programs at the Center for Global Strategy in the 21st Century. Hello, Pavlo. We're glad to see you.
Likewise. Good evening. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. The military exercise Zapad 2025. Your conclusions, both military and otherwise, please share them with us. There was a lot of showmanship. They supposedly tested the Oreshnik and they dressed Putin up in military uniform, made him play with a pistol on camera, so they showcased the Oreshnik. So, in the end, what conclusions can be drawn from this whole event, which really put the entire West, not just us, in a state of anxiety, in my opinion?
Well, when we look at Zapad 2025, I recall Putin in military uniform. It also reminds me of the Caucasus in 2008, if I'm not mistaken, when the then president or acting president Dmitry Medvedev was on the podium of those exercises in military uniform. He was enthusiastically playing at being a powerful military commander, intently looking through his binoculars, completely oblivious to the simple fact that the lens caps were still on. This is the same picture as Putin on the podium at military exercises. The Americans on the podium at military exercises, much ado about nothing. What is Zapad 2025? These are strategic command and staff exercises involving the forces of the Russian Federation. Such exercises are held once every 4 years in 4 strategic directions. This is a body under a method of preparation of command and staff bodies for conducting a strategic offensive operation in a theater of military operations. That's why we often confuse the composition of these Zapad 2025 exercises as opposed to, for example, Vostok 20 or Center or Caucasus. These are exercises conducted by the armed forces of the Russian Federation with the involvement of the armed forces of Belarus, the joint grouping of forces of Russia and Belarus, and the Union State. Therefore, on the one hand, Belarus may claim that these are their exercises, but the Russian-Belarusian exercises are only a component of Russia's strategic command and staff exercises. That's why we heard about the launch of Zircons from the Barents Sea. That's the Northern Fleet. That's why we heard about the deployment of Iskanders in the Kaliningrad enclave. That's the Baltic Fleet. And a whole range of preparation activities for the Leningrad military district, which stretches from Finland to Belarus, as well as some activities in Belarus itself. For those activities that took place in Belarus, in general, for such large-scale exercises, it is possible and even recommended to invite foreign observers. The fact is, first of all, that Russia has long stopped inviting observers from European countries. Belarus operated in full accordance with the overarching Russian strategy, but in this particular instance, with regard to the specific portion of the military exercises that were being conducted in Belarus, observers from a number of countries were invited to the demonstration, including the Belarusian Ministry of Defense, which sent an invitation to the attaché from the United States of America. Representatives of the military attaché from the United States in Belarus were present at these exercises. Yes, on the one hand, this is a demonstration. In the lead up to the invitation, it's worth noting that the invitation was officially sent and then formally accepted between the nations of Russia and Belarus. As for the specific part of the military exercises that took place within Russia, which included the final demonstration and the tactical drills, representatives from the United States were pointedly not invited to attend. It is also significant that at this particular part of the exercises, the Russian leader, President Vladimir Putin, was personally present. Therefore, based on these developments, we can certainly begin to draw some meaningful conclusions about the negotiations between Trump and Lukashenko. The partial lifting of sanctions on Belarus, the sanctions imposed on Belarus in 2020. These are not the sanctions related to the Russia-Ukraine war, but sanctions related to Lukashenko's self-proclamation, Lukashenko proclaiming himself the Belarusian dictator during the 2020 elections in Belarus. The Americans consider these parts of the sanctions necessary to lift. So this is Lukashenko's counter move and the next step by the Belarusian embassy in the United States, the presence of observers originating from the United States of America and were present at the exercises. By the way, besides the United States, there were also observers from 3 other NATO countries at the Belarusian part of the exercises. These were Turkey, Hungary, and Slovakia. Quite a distinguished company. Basically, the composition of observers from the EU and NATO speaks to the unity of these organizations.
Pavel, there's something else I'd like to ask you about the fronts. I wouldn't call these optimistic conclusions because although there is some advance by Russian troops, as various OSINT specialists claim, it is minimal. Over the past week, Russian forces managed to capture about 38 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. The point is that these are the lowest rates since the first weeks of the summer military campaign in April. Most of the territory captured by Russian troops last week was in the south of Donetsk region, and from there they are advancing toward Dnipropetrovsk. Again, let me repeat, it would be strange to celebrate any kind of victory here when the territorial gains are happening at a slower pace. But as a specialist, how would you comment on this rate of advance by the occupying forces? Are they worn out, or is this just a slowdown before another regrouping and another breakthrough? Please give your assessment.
Analysts often like things that are close to statistics. There are statistics specialists, there are analysts. They analyze all kinds of data sets. In this case, when the analysis begins, of daily enemy losses by day, the ratio of losses, even this parameter, gives some indication of the intensity of combat operations for analysis. But when we start calculating generalized figures, not by kilometers occupied, but by kilometers gained, they take the kilometers occupied by the Russians and subtract the kilometers liberated by our armed forces along the entire front line, from Sumy to Kherson. And then all of this is summarized, but these numbers are not very reliable grounds for anything because the situation is different in various sectors of the front. In Sumy and Kharkiv regions just a few weeks ago, Putin and Gerasimov were forced to redeploy most of their assault units, which had been operating in the Kursk region and in the Kursk region of Russia and the Sumy region of Ukraine, to the south to restore their combat capability. And now most of them, particularly the Marine brigades, are concentrated in the Pokrovsk direction, in the second echelon. It's clear that the balance of forces in the north has changed dramatically, and our defenders are gradually pushing them out in some directions. To the west, a section is forming where we are starting to drive the occupiers from our territory. This is a definite plus, but this advantage arose as a result of something shameful. First of all, this means that Putin's generals have concluded that the occupation of the Sumy region is not a priority direction. They need to concentrate their forces on the main axis of attack. Here we have success. On the other hand, For example, the Novopavlivka direction, yes, it's a secondary direction, but in recent weeks and months, it's at the junction of Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Dnipropetrovsk regions. This is an auxiliary direction, but nevertheless, it is precisely in this direction. In the past months, the Russians have made their most effective advances here. There were fewer forces concentrated there than on the Lyman direction or the Kupiansk direction, and especially compared to the Pokrovsk, the larger Sievierodonetsk area. But they did have success there. Now, thanks to partly to the successful actions of our defense forces, the advance in this direction has slowed down. Whether that's a plus or just not a minus, I don't know. How things will develop further is unclear. Next, let's talk about the main directions of the attacks. And here the situation is difficult. We have successfully, with part of our forces, quite successfully resisted the forces of the 51st Army north of Pokrovsk. Moreover, there the enemy might end up in a pretty decent pocket. On the other hand, south and southwest of Pokrovsk, the enemy is concentrating its forces, believing that the group north of Pokrovsk will not only survive, but will be able to encircle the Pokrovsk-Kamernograd agglomeration. The situation remains quite difficult in the Konstantinovka direction. Here we have nothing to boast about. The enemy is pressing. The Lyman direction is also an important one, with converging flanks toward the main axis of attack. There is a threat to the entire Siversky, the whole Siversk group of forces here. The Russians are also pressing quite successfully. We know Kupiansk well too. I can almost anticipate the next question, Pipe 3. The Kupiansk direction. Active enemy operations, and not only from the north, but also from right in the center.
Listen, since we're talking about Kupiansk, let me clarify about Kupiansk right away. The Russians tried to get into the city through the pipe there, as far as I understand. Did they manage to do anything with that? Or were they stopped and hopefully stayed in that pipe? Is there any update?
Basically, this is at least the third or fourth, large scale probably and covered by the media. The third or fourth pipe operation by Russian troops when they try to break through using oil, gas, or water pipes, sending in part of their forces as sabotage and reconnaissance groups to get into our rear or cross the front line. I'm a sailor. I've exited through a torpedo tube before. Back when I was a cadet, a junior officer. And let me tell you, that's quite an operation, especially since you're in an individual breathing apparatus. You have your own oxygen and a nitrogen-oxygen mix. You can breathe pure air as much as you want. In the gas pipeline, you have no idea what you're breathing, and that pipe isn't ventilated. When that pipe is 4 kilometers of unventilated space, it's a death sentence. Everyone who goes in is a dead man walking. Whoever crawls in, some will make it out. Some of them will get out. They'll end up out in the open air, but they won't live long. So another operation is needed. You know, at first I tried to explain the losses here, but then I realized, what difference does it make really when the Russians send people across the fields in groups of 2 or 3? It's with the expectation that out of 10 pairs, maybe 1 or 2 will survive, and the rest will die out in the field. Along the route, and these ones will try to dig in at the end of the tree line, and in this way, build on their success. It is the same thing with the pipe. They will shove approximately 80 people in there, maybe 100, and only about 20 will make it all the way to the end. They might even manage to hold their position for a little while, and then ultimately they die there as well. The same strategy, well, the same Russian tactic, just inside a pipe. So, well, it's important to clarify that this is fundamentally a local issue. Indeed, the enemy forces were successfully able to take advantage of not hydrotechnical or even hydraulic structures, as it turns out, but rather a specific industrial facility, namely an industrial gas pipeline, which they used to attempt an infiltration of our rear. The result is clear. It was destroyed. But in this direction, it's not a key point. This is a tactical episode. By the way, it's a very telling tactical episode, once again showing that our homeland is defended not only by the military. The military are specialists in their own fields. There are pilots, tank operators, sappers, sailors, and navigators, commanders. But there are no specialists in gas pipelines, none in oil refineries. And our military's work will only be truly effective when they are assisted by civilian specialists in their respective fields. If we are striking oil facilities, then a civilian specialist in that area should say, you need to hit here, not there. This is the effective spot. If it's a gas pipeline somewhere, or a dam, a hydraulic structure that could somehow affect the defense, then they should be involved. There are people, civilian specialists, who are experts in this and say, in order to stop the enemy in this area, you need a partial flooding of the reservoir. To do this, you need to strike this particular part of the gate, then the flooding will amount to so many thousands or millions of cubic meters. The same applies to pipelines. As for the military aspect, we've already talked about the Kupiansk direction. The Russians are clearly advancing on Kupiansk from two directions now. The main encirclement direction is an approach from the northwest, and now there's a salient forming, a converging strike from the south. If they succeed on both of these fronts, this situation poses a considerable threat, and the city of Kupiansk is an especially key junction, not only because it is a major railway hub, but also because it is a crucial defensive stronghold.
Let's hope that our defense forces will be able to prevent the enemy's plans you just mentioned. Thank you very much. Pavel Kichok, military expert and head of security programs at the Center for Globalistic Strategy of the 21st Century, was on the air for Ukraine today. Goodbye, Pavel. Thank you again.
Peaceful skies to all of us.
Likewise.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.